So we're about 5 minutes after 2, so I think that we will go ahead and get started. So welcome to today's presentation, Exploring the Many Roads to Quality Work, Insights from the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. This webinar is part of the 2018 CED Grantee Capacity Building Series. This series consists of live webinar-based learning opportunities, as well as information and resources and opportunities to engage with your program specialists and expert technical assistance providers. This series is designed to give you the support you need to successfully execute your projects. So keep an eye out for weekly emails that update you about upcoming events and provide important information for your grant. I'm Whitney Marsland from ICF, and I'm joined today by Gerald Shanklin from the Office of Community Services and our two guest presenters. Gerald will introduce shortly. Today's presentation is being recorded, and you'll be able to access the recording on the Community Economic Development page of the OCS website. And we'll provide you with more information on accessing the recording when it becomes available in an email from the OCS registrar after the presentation. Throughout the presentation, feel free to use the chat and Q&A features inside the WebEx interface as questions come up. You can access these features from the blue icons at the top right of your WebEx window, like you see here on your screen. Use the chat feature to contact the host about any technical issues that you may encounter during the call. And when you do this, be sure to select Host in the Send To box so your question goes directly to the host. And you can use the Q&A feature to type content-related questions as you think of them throughout the presentation. And we will either break into the presentation to ask the question to the presenter, and they can provide an answer, or we'll save the questions to the end, where we'll save some time for Q&A. And when you send a question to the speakers, you'll want to select all panelists in the Send To box. And we'll provide a reminder of how to ask these questions at the end of the call as well. And time permitting, we'll also try to take some questions verbally over the phone. So we'll provide instructions on how to do that at the end of the call as well. But in the meantime, all attendees have been muted to kind of minimize any background noise during the presentation. So now I will turn it over to Gerald to get us started. Gerald, I think that you may be on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Gerald Shanklin, a program specialist with the Office of Community Services. As you all know, the goals and objectives of the Community Economic Development Program, and we'll refer to it as CED, are to create sustainable, permanent, full-time employment opportunities for individuals with low income. You're all hard at work using your CED grant funds to create jobs in your communities. In the past few years, OCS has been focusing not only on how the CED program can help create jobs, but how it can create high-quality jobs that provide people with low income with sufficient wages, benefits, and career opportunities to support their families and thrive economically. We've heard from experts in the area of job quality at recent annual CED grantee conferences and webinars, and we are excited to continue the conversation about what it means to create a quality job and to share strategies for how you as CED grantees can ensure jobs that you create are high-quality jobs. Today, we are pleased to welcome two speakers from the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, who are part of the Federal Reserve Bank's Quality Job Initiative. They will share key data about job quality, highlight some examples of high-quality job creation, and discuss a key resource that features much more information on this topic. Carbonell, Assistant VP of the bank, is going to substitute today for Anjali Zakaria, who is ill, and so we're going to start off with her. But also, she is very well well-versed in this topic today, and I'm certainly looking forward to hearing what she has to say. Gabriella Chiarenza focuses on projects that leverage the intersection of community development research and communication to convey complex findings to a wide range of audiences in approachable and innovative ways, and seeks to improve public access to and understanding of data and policy information through her work. She is the managing editor of Invested, the Boston Fed's interview-based publication, and you'll hear more about that during the presentation. So let's welcome Sol and Gabriella. And so thank you so much for being with us to share your work, and now I'm going to turn it over to Sol.
For the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston to be here. Gabriella and I are very excited to share a little bit of what we've been learning so far in our journey on job quality. So again, my name is Sol Carbonell. I'm an Assistant Vice President here in Boston. I oversee part of the engagement team in community development. But I'll start with a sentence about the Federal Reserve Bank. For those of you that may not be familiar with the role of the Fed in this, I'll say that we are part of the central bank in the country, and we have a decentralized system, and part of the mission of our system is really related to a dual mandate. We were created by Congress to fulfill two responsibilities. One is the idea of price stability, and that's, you know, when you hear the Fed talk about interest rates, and some of that is related to our monetary policy responsibilities. But we take that, you know, we fulfill those responsibilities also with another part of the mandate in mind, which is related to what we call maximum employment. So in community development, we see our role in understanding the quality of jobs and the evolution of jobs in our economy as truly supporting this mandate from the Federal Reserve System as a whole. So we're really excited to be able to share some of those lessons with you all. Part of how we wanted to start this conversation, and I know we are eager to get all of your questions too, because it sounds like you have been discussing this topic before. Part of how we want to start this conversation is really sharing with you some pieces of data that were just released recently to ground our conversation on what the economy looks like today. And this is with the idea of truly us envisioning an economy that works for both workers and businesses, an economy in which both of these entities and individuals and families can thrive together. So our journey into job quality really started with this vision for an inclusive economy that works for both businesses and workers, and a recognition that we need to think differently about some of our approaches to accomplishing this. Part of the role that community development plays in the Federal Reserve is to try to surface how low-income people experience the economy, and how, and really lending our research and analytical capabilities to understand how we can inform policy and practice to improve the lives of low-income individuals. So that's the lens in which we approach our work. So let's move on to how we want to start this conversation with really some details on a recent survey that was just released. So this is really fresh to ground the conversation on what we're seeing in the economy. This is a report on the economic well-being of U.S. households, and it was from the data collected in 2017, and again, it was just released a few days ago. So I'll start with a few highlights of this. I think for those of you that are doing work on the ground, this is, you know, nothing that you see here is going to be a surprise, because this is what the people that you're serving on a day-to-day basis are experiencing this. So we're able to capture some of this and aggregate it. So let's go over this. So 40% of adults do not have a savings to cover an unexpected expense of $400. Over 20% of adults are not able to pay all their current month's bill in full. about 30% of adults have family income that varies from month to month, and 10% experience hardship because of monthly changes in income. And this is important, and when we talk a little bit more about how we define job quality, we'll mention things like income stability, income predictability, so keep these numbers in mind when we talk about that too. At the same time, about 16% of workers have irregular work schedules imposed by the employer, and 10% receive their work schedules less than a week in advance. So think about the implications for those that are trying to plan for childcare or other things that happen in a household. So that's only 10% of the workers that receive the work less than a week in advance. Over 25% of adults skipped necessary medical care in 2017 due to being unable to afford the cost. And last but not least, less than 20% of non-retired adults think that their retirement savings are on track, and 25% have no retirement savings or pension at all. So that's the context for how we want to ground the conversation today. So when we started thinking about understanding the evolution of the economy and workers and how low-income workers are faring in New England, which is the region that we served, we decided to take a look at who is earning less than $15 an hour. And let me clarify, not because we are endorsing a specific policy, because we can't do that at the Fed, but most importantly because this is the number that has been in the policy debate. And we think it's important that we understand what's behind this and we demystify some of what this population looks like and what assumptions people may have about this population as well. So I should have actually said in the beginning that all the opinions that I have to say today are my own opinions and don't represent the opinions of my colleagues at the Federal Reserve System or the Board of Governors. So that's a standard disclaimer that everyone at the Fed has to say. So, I'm saying it a little bit later, but that applies to whatever I said before. So let's think a little bit about who's earning below $15 an hour, and this is. It sounds like this is national data as well. So one of the things that it was, that was interesting for us in New England, it was that it was really 1/3 of the workers who were earning less than $15 an hour. Now, when you think about this population, some may be tempted, to think that there's either a specific type of individual or, a young teen maybe just getting started in their career, or somebody that is just having a part-time, side job. So that's not really what we found. So if you think about it, if you look at some of these points, we found that the majority of them are women, are disproportionately Black and Latino. The vast majority are adults, so not necessarily the teens, getting started in their careers. More than half actually have some college education, and approximately 20% have a bachelor's degree or higher. So that's also surprising because the other myth out there is that, sure, as you're, regardless of whether, the age factor, also if you have, maybe less education, you'll see lower wages. But in some cases, that wasn't necessarily, the situation. And again, most are primary earners in their families, and most are full-time workers. So this gives you a sense of who is earning below $15 in New England, and my assumption is that as we begin to do some of the analysis in other parts of the country, some of these things may hold true as well. So when we think about how we want to we're interested in the outcomes, which is ultimately improving employment opportunities for low and moderate income individuals. So as we think about these outcomes, what we've seen is that, most of the time we can think about the strategies that organizations or individuals are employing in sort of 3 different buckets. One is the idea of upskilling the worker. So this is where you can think about access to education and training opportunities, and thinking about, what the jobs of the future are going to need and making sure that our educational institutions are preparing individuals for those type of jobs. So all of those strategies fall under this category of upskilling the worker. The second one is removing barriers to employment. So this is when you think about when you can see focuses on transportation or childcare, for example, to make sure that workers can get to jobs and that they can participate in the labor market. And the third type of strategies, which is the one that we are really interested in understanding and thinking about how we make progress on that, is really the idea of changing the nature of work itself. Thinking about how do we upgrade the jobs that are being generated in our economy, and actually understanding the evolution of the kinds of jobs that are available in our economy today. So those are the third type of strategies that we at the Boston Fed and a number of colleagues across the Federal Reserve System are trying to understand and are trying to think about it, from a business perspective, from a worker perspective. What does that look like, and what are the incentives that work, and how do we get there? So moving on to the next slide, how we arrived at that was really through an understanding of how jobs have evolved over time in our economy, and we've seen a number of things. On the one hand, we've seen this idea of wage polarization, and some of the charts that you have in front of you are depicting some of this. So we see the hourly wages for workers by wage percentiles, and what you've seen, you can look at it in different ways, but ultimately what this is saying is that for the lowest income workers, those that are at the bottom, their wages have not necessarily increased. So when the economists actually look at this, they talked about this idea of decoupling. There was a point in time in which profits were coupled with wages increases, and as you saw, profits increased and sort of the outputs of work increased, that there was a point in time in which the workers were actually seeing the benefit of that. And there's a point in time in which you see these two lines that diverge, and in the context of skyrocketing CEO pay and and corporation profits and some of that, what a lot of the experts point out is this moment, again, in which wages have been decoupled with profits and outcomes for workers. So the other phenomenon that we are observing and is really this idea of hollowing out of the middle class jobs. So as you think about the progression and the changes in employment by skill level, this is the graph that you see on the left, from 1980 to 2005, you can see here, that the highest, percentages are on the far right and on the far left, right? So that means essentially that we're seeing a huge number of low-wage work appearing in our economy and low-skilled jobs, and at the same time, this high-skilled jobs that everybody talks about in tech and others, where all the conversation about preparing workers for the future is mostly about those jobs. But that necessarily doesn't reflect what our, that conversation doesn't necessarily reflect the fact that the jobs that are growing in our economy are the low-wage jobs, the service jobs, and others such as that. So, you see some of that reflected in the chart on the right, in the changes in employment by occupation, by, skill level, and it's part of the same picture, right? This idea that the service jobs are some of the fastest growing jobs in our economy as well. So when we put all of that together, we start thinking about what does it mean to have a quality job today in the context of some of these things. So when we talk to both, experts, economists, but also people in our region, workers themselves, these are some of the things that the aspects that we think are important. One is clearly wages, and you see it, at the center, and that's for a reason. But there are a number of other factors that are related to access to affordable and quality benefits, for example, and the predictability of the schedules and other work conditions. And also, at the same time, this idea of income stability and predictable income. So not only knowing, how much, clearly the number of hours that work is going to affect your incomes, and having the ability to know that in advance and to know the period of time, it's clearly incredibly helpful for workers to be able to plan ahead. So these are a lot of the elements that we think can truly affect the quality of a job. And one that is also important, I don't want to forget to mention it, is worker engagement and worker voice. And that can mean a lot of different things to different people, but I think what we mean here are two different things. One is the opportunity for workers to yes, provide input in operations and ideas for how to do the job better, but also, and most importantly, is the ability to negotiate the terms of the employment and the conditions of employment as well, and having power to do that as well. So those are some of the elements that we think can clearly impact the quality of the job. And let me, talk a little bit about the business perspective on this, because it's not that, we are thinking a lot these days about the language that we even use to describe some of these things. And it's not that we understand the value of having a job, the value of having a better, a first job, as opposed to no job at all. But at the same time, we're trying to think about what the floor looks like for all workers, regardless of where they are, who they are, their educational level, and some of other dimensions, right? And what we observe is that that floor perhaps is at a place where, where it is today may be a little bit different than where it was before, at least for some workers. So that's something that we're trying to understand. In terms of the business perspective, we are spending a lot of time trying to hear from businesses directly, visiting companies, and understanding from the research that tries to make the case for the business value in job quality. So we've been impressed by the work of Zainab Ton, and we wanted to highlight some of that here, because she has done some interesting work in the retail sector in particular, and really studying companies like Costco, Trader Joe, Quick Trip. And so she's a business professor at MIT in the School of Management. And a lot of what she talks about really, and she started this from a completely operations perspective, and then she ended up working on job quality. And what she was trying to understand initially was how companies, the value that companies placed in labor. And what she learned was that companies that treated labor not necessarily as a cost that needs to be minimized, but a real asset that needs to be leveraged, had a profound difference on how they looked at their operations and their effectiveness, and they were able to leverage that and use that to improve their again, operations and their culture and their way of doing business in the way that actually resulted in more profits for the companies. So a lot of times there's this false debate about, if we do something more for workers, we're going to go out of business, and that's not necessarily, what some of the research is saying about some of these practices. There are clear benefits to companies around retention, productivity, morale, and some of the things that actually help them really be better businesses and produce better outcomes as companies and also for their workers. And so in the New York Times, there was a recent article that talked a little bit about this, and it was surfacing a study that was done in Gap stores, where they actually gave a set of, it was a randomized control trial, and they gave a set of managers the opportunity to play around with the flexibility that they were giving to some of their associates. and just to think about what the different outcomes were when people were provided with consistent and better schedules. And what this study showed was that there was an increase in productivity in those stores where the managers were encouraged to do this. So that provided also some real insights, from a retail company. And I think as we see more and more companies in different industries play around and experiment with different practices, we're looking forward to try to surface some of those and understand those, because it's clearly different, depending on the industry in which the company operates and what the competitive pressures may be on them, or also what the revenue model looks like, and all of those things are really nuanced. So you have to truly understand the business to understand how this may play around in this. I recently had the chance to talk to the owner of a manufacturing company in Aurora, Illinois, and some of his insights were really profound. He shared with me the transformation that he has seen in his company when they started valuing frontline workers and thinking much more intentionally about the kind of culture that they wanted to create. And working with frontline workers that had been there in that company for a long time and engaging them in this process had really resulted in that company to increase their profits and transform the company in a way that was really amazing to see. So we've had a lot of examples. I think we're eager to do more research and to provide more data so that can hopefully inform practice and policy as well. And clearly, the other piece to mention is we are an environment, one of the tightest labor markets that we've seen in New England and obviously in other parts of the country. And I think we've seen employers, and we hear from even intermediaries that are working with employers and companies that want to become employers of choice and are having trouble attracting and retaining people. And I think a lot of times, what we hear from some of these intermediaries as well is that they are working with companies in a totally different way than they were before, and actually, asking about, so what benefits do you offer now, or have you thought about the wages that you're providing? And some of those conversations are really happening. So I think it's a good opportunity for those that are working with intermediaries to think about how could they strengthen those sort of relationships to continue to provide better value to businesses that are using those services as well, and also create value for both the companies but also the workers. So there are a number, as we think about the incentives for improving job quality, I think this is, takes a multi-pronged approach to get to those outcomes for more workers. So clearly, public policy plays an incredibly important role. And, in particular industries, for example, when it might be harder for one employer to take a particular action, I think public policy can level a playing field sometimes. Or also when we think about where the floor is for workers in general, I think there's clearly a lot of debate nationally about the role of things like the minimum wage or paid family medical leave, for example. I think there's, public policy, the role of public policy cannot be understated. At the same time, there are other levers and mechanisms to incentivize and increase job quality, and those could include government contracts. We've seen in a number of cities or others start to experiment with some of this. And I think traditionally, those focusing on contracts have usually tended to focus on the creation and preservation of jobs. That has been sort of the language that we've used. And I think we have to start asking ourselves about quality and how do we think about that? How do we measure that? And how do we make sure that we are providing the tools that those that are going to be participating in contracts will be able to collect some of that effectively as well, because there could be challenges around that too. And there are other incentives around procurement policies. We've seen a range of institutions, from big to small to, even banks or financial institutions that are truly leveraging their procurement to think about how to make progress in this space. So that's something to be thinking about. And also the role of community benefits agreements. Recently, I was here in California. There's some interesting experiments around this happening, and I'll be happy to provide more details if that's of interest to anyone on the call. And then at the same time, I think CDFIs have been truly at the forefront of this work, and there are a number of other funds nationally, Job Quality Fund, that are, again, experimenting and thinking about how to best incentivize this and sharing lessons. CDFIs, community-bound financial institutions, play an incredibly important role in providing capital to small businesses or other entities across the country. In New England, we're fortunate to have a number of CDFIs that have very proactively thought about how they could incorporate job quality criteria in their lending portfolio. So they're thinking actively about how to measure this, how to work with companies that want to test ideas. And also, I think all of this work comes with a recognition that we have to meet companies where they are, right? And it's not a one-size-fits-all. So CDFIs truly, I think, have an advantage in the fact that they have those relationships with businesses and companies and can meet businesses where they are and think about, how to make progress, based on the company and where they want to be heading. So I think this is being flexible also about what we mean, how to improve job quality and making sure that we are meeting employers where they are and engaging them in how they can make progress to begin the conversation. I think it's really important as well. So in terms of what we're doing, I just want to end with this and also pass it to my colleague Gabriella so that she can tell us a little bit more about Invested, which is something we're really excited about. We're really trying to engage as many perspectives as we can on this issue, particularly understanding the voice in surfacing voice from workers, but also the business community as well. And we're really intentional about that. We think engaging employers is part of the solution and needs to be a key element of any strategic initiative around this, and that's partly what we are committed to doing. So at the Boston Fed, we have a number of councils where we regularly get to hear about these different perspectives. But we're out there, and we want to hear from people directly and surface some of that. So I want to pass it to my colleague Gabriella so that she can tell us and she can share with you how exactly we're doing that and what we're learning from that.
Great. Thank you, Sol. I will try to be quick. I know we probably have some questions to get to, so I will go quickly here. But so I am heading up our new Invested magazine. We just launched it last year. The first issue came out in November of last year, and we've just launched our second issue yesterday, so it is hot off the press. For our first 4 issues of the magazine, we're looking at aspects of job quality. And just to give you a little background on the publication, it's entirely interview-based and it's entirely online, and we're hoping to use that media to take advantage of multimedia opportunities with that. As Sol mentioned, we're really looking for a mix of voices. So we've been talking to people on the ground across New England, including researchers and, experts in the traditional sense, but we also consider workers and employers and people who are working with those groups to be experts on this as well. So we've spoken with a number of workers, a number of employers, some community organizations and others who are working with them. And then each issue culminates in some recommendations that are based on what we've learned from the people we've spoken with. So I'd really encourage you to check it out. There is a link there. You can also just go to bostonfed.org/getinvested. And if you have any trouble, just let me know. But just to, Laura had mentioned that she wanted me to say a little bit about some of the things that we've learned so far. So with our first 2 issues, our first issue was on flexible and unpredictable scheduling. And our second issue looks more at worker voice, both from the traditional labor union front all the way through worker movements and employer engagement. So in these first 2 issues, a couple of things have sort of floated to the surface about quality jobs. And they really kind of go in two areas. One is the philosophy. So the philosophy of the leadership of the company is very important. If this is an important aspect to the CEO, the people who are in charge of making the rules of the company, it filters down to everyone in the company and leads to a better work experience. So for example, one of the companies that we visited for our second issue is called Sertronics. It's a small contract manufacturer in New Hampshire, and it's run by a woman who came out of social work, just came into electronics manufacturing from something completely different. And she didn't know that much about electronics manufacturing, but she knew a lot about people. And so her whole philosophy is about treating her employees as people, as whole people with ideas and different skills. So at Sertronics, they really focus everything they do around cross-training and also providing opportunities for people to try new things, advance into different jobs, be part of decision-making. They're also employee-owned. So that's an example of sort of a philosophy of the leadership coming down into benefiting all of the workers. Also, it's really important, as you probably imagine, that all the policies and practices that we're talking about really be informed by workers. If it's going to affect their lives on the job, they should have a voice in what that looks like. So again, an example, we spoke with some folks at Matahari Women Workers Center, which is here in Boston, and they are a group of domestic workers, mostly nannies, some cleaning people, and they have come together because they work in jobs where they're always isolated, and they're often abused because they don't have the visibility of other workers, they don't have a union. So being able to come together and work together for policy that advances what they need. So here in Massachusetts, they were influential in passing the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights, which just allows workers to have some of the same rights that you would have at other companies where you have more of those protections. They've also really focused on making sure that nannies have contracts so that they aren't abused on the job. So that's just an example of how workers can really create better policies and practices. The other side of this is really about adaptation to change. So everyone we've spoken with has mentioned that the workforce is changing rapidly, the workplace is changing rapidly. So there are a couple of things here. One is technology. So in both issues, we've really looked at how technology plays a role in some of these things. And really, technology can be good or bad. It's not about the actual technology, it's about how it's used. So for example, when we were looking at scheduling, there are a lot of new apps and software programs that allow managers to schedule everyone down to 15-minute shifts and change their shift at the last minute, and it really wreaks havoc on workers who are trying to plan the rest of their lives. So there are several apps that are trying to sort of leverage this technology to be good for the worker. So we looked at one app called Shift, S-H-Y-F-T, and they are trying to give workers the power to set their own schedules, trade shifts, make it easier on managers as well, because workers sort of take it upon themselves to make sure everything's covered, but that if they have an emergency last minute, they can switch their shift. So it just empowers the worker to have a little more control over their schedule. In terms of flexibility, both companies and organizations that are representing workers need to sort of be flexible and adjust to situations that might not be the norm. So in this issue that we've just put out yesterday, we looked at a lobstermen's union in Maine. Lobstermen typically work completely on their own. There are 5,000 of them up and down the coast of Maine who are all in their own boats, and they hadn't really been working together at all. The lobster price fell, and they really needed to do something to protect themselves and their communities that rely so heavily on this industry. So they formed a union with the International Association of Machinists, a much larger union that was able to sort of help them navigate that. And now they're able to go to the State House in Augusta and stand up for themselves. It's a very interesting story. The last thing I'll mention is that the workforce is really changing. The demographics of the workforce, the different skills that people bring, and also the types of jobs that are available. So all of that really comes out when we look at what jobs are available, what kind of quality a job means. And that's all I have to say. Sorry, I thought I had a last point there. So I would really encourage you to check out the issues. They're great. We have a lot of really wonderful viewpoints presented all across New England and beyond. Some researchers really balanced with the voices of workers and employers, and we actually have some videos from our visits to some of these workplaces in this second issue. So please do check it out.
All right, so we look forward to questions.
Okay, great. So thanks to the speakers for that presentation. And so now we have about 15 minutes to take some questions. So as a reminder, you can submit a written question through the Q&A feature in the WebEx platform. When you submit a question, make sure that you send to all panelists in the Send To option, so we're able to review your question and address it. You can also ask your question verbally. So at this time, we will unmute everyone's line, and you are welcome to chime in with your question. In order to eliminate additional background noise, we ask that you are not currently if you're not asking a question, please mute your phone or computer. So we'll unmute you within the WebEx system, and you can mute yourself on your end. And then when you have a question, you can unmute yourself and ask, and we can address as many as possible. If you have not muted yourself and we detect any background noise, we will kind of manually mute the lines within WebEx. So then if that is the case and you want to ask a question but your line is muted, you can just send us a note in the chat feature that we talked about at the beginning of the call, and we will unmute you and you can ask your question. If you are asking a question over the phone, just introduce yourself, and if you could say what organization that you're from, that would be helpful, and you can do that as well when you submit a question, a written question via WebEx. So we will give folks a few minutes to ask questions, and if there's someone on the line that has a question, feel free to chime in.
This is Gerald Shanklin from the Office of Community Services. I just had a question regarding the incentives that I think Sol talked about, and one with government contracts. Do you have any examples of any covenants that might be in a government contract currently? Or?
Yeah, so let me mention a couple of things that we are just learning about. So I don't want to hold everything as a best practice because I think our criteria for best practice at the Fed is pretty lengthy. So I'll say that things that we're curious about include some efforts from a financial institution that has actually asked all of their suppliers to use an assessment from B-Lab that certifies B corporations, so that they can track with it. B-Lab is an organization that has produced an assessment that measures a number of different dimensions. So beyond job quality, they also consider the environment, for example, community engagement of a company, and diversity practices, and some of the things. So I think we've seen people experimenting with the idea of this assessment that B-Lab provides and using some of that to prioritize suppliers that get specific scores within this assessment. We're also seeing on a more broad basis, there are a number of cities across the country that have launched what is called the Best For effort that also leverages specific tools from this organization called B-Lab and provides incentives in the forms of awards that a city can offer to a business, not necessarily in contracting yet. I think there's some work that needs to happen on that front, which is currently being planned. At the same time, we are curious about some efforts in California, and the most recent one that I've heard about is the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, which has actually formed an entire office around community benefits. I think they have about 8 people working on that. And essentially what they do is they thought differently about how they do some of the contracting, primarily for infrastructure. If you think about infrastructure for utilities and the number of contracts to maintain some of the utility infrastructure. And they're basically providing, so this is, usually what we've seen is that job quality is one component of a number of different criteria that either a specific company or government entity wants to use to rate a potential supplier or vendor, or partner. So, I think we've seen job quality emerge much more recently around some of those initiatives. So, I think there's more work that needs to be done in this space, but it's a really promising space. And I think it would be interesting, for those of you that are interested in more, I know this summer we are going to be having a summer intern at the Boston Fed that is going to be cataloging some of these and having interviews to understand, what the effectiveness has been in some of these practices, what the folks that have incorporated some of these criteria into the processes, what they're seeing in terms of how companies respond to those, or any challenges that they may have emerged. So we'll hopefully be tracking a little bit this in a more systematic way, and after the summer we'll be able to provide more details. But I would, if you're curious about this, I would try to research some of the efforts by BLab and the best for New York, best for Rhode Island. At least those are two that I can point to, and then this idea of community benefits in San Francisco.
And that's actually a good segue, because we received 2 questions over WebEx about the community benefit agreements that you mentioned, and if you could provide some examples of those and kind of what are they and how do they work.
Right. So usually, this is, the example that I mentioned was in San Francisco. So that's one example. Usually, how community benefit agreements come about is you have a specific organization or company that perhaps may be either opening in a particular location or expanding, or there's some kind of change that happens and motivates some of this. And, so just imagine the idea of, let's say, in New England, we've seen this more recently, a casino opening up, or, some kind of company opening up or expanding in a specific area. And this is where the negotiation power of the community comes into play. And, through these set of processes, what gets established is the commitment of the organization to either provide jobs in a specific location, or sources jobs from a specific community, or contribute money to a specific cause in that community. And what we're seeing more is that, so in most of these agreements in the past have been really related to, the idea of retaining and creating, particularly creating jobs for specific communities. Now, what the salary or wages of those jobs are, I think it's now being more, consistent, or we're seeing more eagerness to establish those as well, as opposed to just the idea of creating specific jobs. And then obviously, this is the idea that there is basically like a contract, right, between an organization, a company, and a specific community. And that may be an organization representing the community. Sometimes a city, a particular city may play a role, depending on what kind of ordinances that city has, about development that happens in place and where jobs need to come from, or the wages that need to be paid for those jobs. So there's a lot of variation around that as well. But that's usually how they come about. And there may be someone else on the call as an expert in community benefit agreements that may want to chime in on this as well. But that's something worth for us to be that we're going to be looking into in more detail, as I said, over this summer. Both the idea of community benefit agreements, but also procurement practices more specifically.
Great. Do we have anyone over the phone who wants to verbally ask a question? remember, if you want to ask a question over the phone, to make sure that you have unmuted yourself. Okay, so we can go to some other written questions. Another question was, can you discuss additional information or resources on strategies for removing barriers to employment?
So for that question, I think that's a great question too. I'll say we are also in parallel focusing on the question of childcare. And partly because we see childcare as the infrastructure to work, and you know, if a working parent doesn't have access to reliable, affordable, and quality childcare, you can expect the productivity of that person, the engagement in the labor market to be different, right? So, you know, you know, I think there's been a ton of efforts across the country that over time have emphasized the quality of childcare and the needs to ensure for minimum standards and raise quality. At the same time, I think we are interested in understanding, for example, childcare deserts. And in different parts of the country and in parts of our region, particularly in the more rural areas of our region, you know, somebody may need to rely on much more informal care or family care or, you know, different form of care. And what we see is that I think the challenge is that as a country, we don't really have a good system for supporting working parents when it comes to childcare. So we have a very fragmented, you know, provision of either vouchers or, you know, and center-based care and some of that. So I think when it comes to barriers, the one, again, that we're focusing on is this one of childcare and this really intersection of affordability, quality, and availability to make sure that we're not losing the care out of childcare, and to ensure that, yes, with you know, minimum and acceptable levels of quality, because no one wants to compromise on that, that we can actually support working parents. So I can, you know, for anyone interested in that type of barrier, we can go deeper into that and help connect with the staff that are working on this. I think when it comes to other type of barriers, you know, transportation or others, so we have colleagues across the system that have been experimenting, you know, just trying to understand. That is a very nuanced conversation. So I think depending on what part of the country you come from, or even what part of our region you come from, you know, the challenges and opportunities are going to be completely different. So I hate to you know, make any broad statements, because that's a very nuanced conversation as well. I think I would say that for anyone that is more interested in this broad idea of investing in the worker and training and skills, a great resource is the investinwork.org. It's a website by the Federal Reserve System, and we have a number of publications already and the proceedings from a national conference that we hosted last year with experts on this topic. And also we have an upcoming book in the next couple of months. We'll have a book that will be posted there as well. And there's a lot to be said about promising approaches that are addressing skills. But again, we're not, we are part of a system-wide effort in supporting some of our colleagues across the system on that, but we are trying to really put an emphasis on the idea of quality as our primary emphasis in Boston.
So we have 1 minute left. I'll check in again to see if anyone wants to ask a verbal question. And if not, we have another written question. I think we have time for one more. So this question is, are you aware of any franchises emphasizing quality jobs?
It's a really good question. I'm sure there are. I can't think of any off the top of my head. Boloco, Anjali is back, and she says Boloco, which is, I don't know, are they local just to New England? I'm not sure.
Sweet Green is another.
Sweet Green.
Sweet Green, Boloco.
Quick Trip is another. They're a southern and midwestern chain. Costco is actually one that puts a heavy premium on job quality.
Some of these are examples that I mentioned before are featured in Zainab's book on job quality. It's called The Good Job Strategy. So for folks that want to be more intimately familiar with some of these companies' practices and with her framework for how to approach this, I encourage folks to check that out.
And Gerald, do you have any kind of last-minute questions or any comments as we wrap up the call?
No, I just want to thank the panelists again. We're fortunate to have you guys, and we want to certainly follow your work as you go forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you to the speakers for today's presentation. Just quickly before we wrap up, I just wanted to bring everyone's attention to next week's webinar, and just a reminder about that. It is the Partnering with the EPA Healthy Places for Healthy People program presentation, which will be next Thursday, May 31st at 2 p.m. We also encourage you to take advantage of the opportunity to meet one-on-one with an expert technical assistance provider. You can sign up at the link provided, and you will be matched with a TA provider to participate in a virtual meeting. So you can use this time to get some guidance on any aspect of your project that is challenging, or ask specific questions about something related to your grant. These TA providers are here for you, so please take advantage of this opportunity. And as more webinars and different resources are available through these series, you'll be notified through the weekly 2018 CED Grantee Capacity Building Series update email sent through OCS. So if you have any kind of follow-up questions for today's speakers, definitely send them to us at ocsregistrar@icf.com, and we will get those answered for you. Again, thank you for everyone for calling in and for our speakers for today's presentation.